We'll be talking about Aquinas today. So we'll be covering Aquinas, the Odyssey, free will. We will see what Aquinas has to say about God as the source of all that is good, and this sort of mirrors a bit, it echoes a bit what Augustine said 800-ish years before Aquinas. We will look at his views on evil as privation, and then we will look also at his ideas on free will and moral evil. Now, for some context, he was born Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 in a place called Roccasecca in Italy, which is a place near Naples, the city of Naples. He was born in a noble family, and he was the son of a count, a certain Count Landulf of Aquino. In fact, in Italian, he's called Tommaso d'Aquino, which is Thomas from Aquinas. And that's where he gets his name. Even Da Vinci, for instance, Leonardo da Vinci, Leonardo from Vinci, which is a place. Caravaggio, it's the same thing, Michelangelo da Caravaggio. So this seems to be a trend in medieval culture, that you get your surname, amongst other things, from from the place you're from. And his father was a count, therefore he was also a knight, and his mum was descended from nobility as well. She was a Hungarian noble, or at least she was descended from Hungarian nobility. So he had quite a background, let's say. He got his education, his early education, from the Benedictines. He was at Monte Cassino, the famous place, the famous Monte Cassino that was then bombed in the Second World War. We lost it, really. So he was getting this education from Monte Cassino, the Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino. And there he was exposed to what was considered classical education at the time, Latin, the study of Greek, study of maths and philosophy. Then, at the age of 14, he made the decision to join the Dominicans. And his family wasn't quite happy with his decision, with his wishes. They wanted him, the plans were for him to take up a career in law or become somehow involved in the government, and someone have a child like this, descended from nobility, join a mendicant order. It wasn't quite what they had hoped for. But anyways, within a year, within 12 months, he would then, in 1240, he would then join the Dominicans. He would then study with the Dominicans in Paris, in France. And when he arrived in Paris, there was this revival of classical Greek philosophy happening, especially when it came to the study of Aristotle. And this would leave quite an impact, as we will see, on Aquinas' philosophy. Aquinas is very Aristotelian. In fact, something for you to know, if you're in one of these pub quizzes, which never happen anyways, but he never calls Aristotle by name. He always refers to him as the philosopher with a capital P. Imagine the reverence he felt for Aristotle. And the way Aristotle sort of rejoined the West in terms of this interest that there grew within scholastic circles was that his works had been getting commentaries by Muslim scholars of all places. We would tend to think, but the Muslims, the Greeks, well, actually Muslim scholars got very interested in classical Greek works. There was a period in early Islam when they were really at the peak of study. and you had people like Averroes, who were Muslim scholars studying classical Greek literature and philosophy. And this early period in Aquinas' life would lay sort of the grounds, would lay the foundations for what he would later achieve as a philosopher, as a theologian. He would, like I said, study in Paris, and this would expose him to really the creme de la creme in terms of academia. Then he, as he grew older, he would stick to this lifestyle. He would devote his life to academia. Once he started to study in Paris, he would, like I said, he would be exposed to Aristotle and Averroes, etc. And one of the things that sort of troubled Aristotle and troubled Aquinas a bit were certain positions taken by Averroists vis-a-vis Aristotle, and of course this would be because these guys were coming from different religion, so their interpretation of Aristotle fit best their worldview. Aquinas, being Christian, being brought up essentially with the Benedictines and then joining the Dominicans, was very much a convinced Christian. So what he tried to do, what he wanted to do, was to take Aquinas' philosophy and somehow synthesize it with Christian thought, sort of make a synthesis of them, bring them together. And this synthesis that he worked on would lead to his basis on natural theology. One of the things he would do, for instance, would be to argue for the existence of God based on reason alone. So one of the things he wanted to do is to prove that God exists. And he would, in his Summa Theologia, or Summa Theologica, or Theologica, sometimes you find it written. But what he tried to do was to prove that God exists, and this is no mean feat, it's no small feat, actually. He came up with, if I'm not mistaken, 5 proofs for the existence of God. We'll have a very quick, brief overview of that as we progress with the lecture. Anyways, by 1244 he would be forced to return to Italy by his family. There were political tensions within the dynamics with the Dominican order. He, like I said, they weren't really happy that he joined the Dominicans, so he was called back. They house imprisoned him for a time. He was kept logged by his family for a time, but then eventually he managed to escape and start again his studies. He, like I said, he joined the Dominicans, and he was also with the Dominicans in Naples. So he was also based in Naples, his home region, his home area. And there he continued to work on the synthesis that we've mentioned, the synthesis of Aristotelian thought and Christian belief. There he would also start to write his first major works. I've mentioned the Summa Theologia. There's also the Summa Contra Gentiles, which are very, very important works when it comes to medieval philosophy. The Summa Theologia basically is a comprehensive work of theology. It tries to cover everything that he wanted to cover when it came to Christian doctrine. The Summa Contra Gentiles is a defense of Christian theology. Against what? Against the Gentiles. those pagans, the non-Christian philosophers. So he's trying to defend essentially his belief system against opposing belief systems. In 1252, he returns to Paris to continue his studies, and there he would be engaged in some public debates with Averroists, that is, people influenced by Averroes, the Islamic scholar of Aristotle. And something interesting that he brings up there in these debates is that faith and reason are not opposed to each other. They're rather complementary. Now, this is very interesting because the tendency is to claim that faith transcends reason. The blessed is him or blessed is her who believes for the sake of believing, who believes without needing proof or evidence or logical proof. In fact, we have that famous scene from what's it called, from the Acts of the Apostle, if I'm not mistaken, when Christ turns up and Saint Thomas the Apostle sticks his finger in his rib. There's this gorgeous painting by Caravaggio displaying this. And, Thomas the doubter, the one who doubts. Why? Because Thomas wanted, as in Thomas the Apostle, not Aquinas, wanted proof. Well, Thomas Aquinas seems to be living to his namesake in claiming that, there's no contradiction between reason and faith in that sense. In fact, he claims that reason can help us to understand the natural world, while, on the other hand, faith can help us to understand the supernatural world. So it's like they have their domains. So that's how they can complement each other to get a better view of the cosmos in all its sense, in all its glory. You look at the world around you, but you also think of that which goes beyond, that which transcends the physical world. You look at the supernatural world. You do that through faith. Whereas to understand better the natural world, you do that through reason. 1256, he starts teaching in Naples and continues to write, etc. He makes several contributions to the fields of natural law, which again is has Aristotelian descendancy, and also metaphysics, which again one can arguably claim that metaphysics is a field spearheaded by Aristotle himself. Later in his life, he shifted his focus from teaching and writing to serving as a theological advisor to popes and other religious authorities. By this time, he had grown himself quite a name as an authority in his field in theology, and he never quite left behind his attempt to synthesize Aristotelian and Christian thought. In fact, it would be a lifelong commitment of his. And then, like I said, he was an advisor to popes, etc. And in fact, between 65 and 68, 1265 and 68, for 3 years, he was summoned by Pope Alexander IV to serve as his theological advisor. And he was responsible, amongst other things, for a variety of theological matters, advising the Pope on a number of theological matters, including the nature of God and his what constitutes salvation in yeah, when we talk of the salvation of humanity, what is it about? He also argued and consulted the Pope. He has acted as a consultant to the Pope in terms of the relationship between faith and reason. And eventually, in 68, he was appointed Archbishop of Naples. He was appointed, but he never took up the position because he felt that it took away. He was committed to theological studies. So you get appointed by the Pope as Archbishop. You turn him down because you want to work on your writing, and that's what he did. He in fact continued to work on the Summa, on his Summa Theologia, and as well as other works. Anyways, to cut a long story short, although to be honest, this also mirrors his life. His own life was cut quite short when he was invited to travel to France, to Lyon. There was a Council of Lyon, a council of the church. It's called the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, and he was traveling to go there on invitation to try and work along with other important members of the church to try and reunite the Eastern Church, what we call Orthodox Church, as in the church descended from Constantinople, with the Western churches, the churches that are mostly based around Rome, around the Vatican. Well, he was 49 years old. He was traveling to Lyon. He fell ill and died suddenly at the age of 49. He was quite young. In terms of his legacy, he left such a contribution to both philosophy and to theology. He was influential on Catholic belief. He also predated the Protestant reform, spearheaded by Martin Luther. He predated that by a couple of centuries really. So his theology also had influence on Protestant theology. Now, when it comes to Aristotelian philosophy, Aquinas engaged with these works, and he engaged quite profoundly when it came to metaphysics and logic and natural philosophy. Aristotle emphasized a lot reason and logic. In fact, much of the basic logic we do today is Aristotelian logic. When we study logic, much of it is Aristotle's work, and this would resonate deeply with Aquinas' desire to reconcile faith and reason. He was also influenced by Plato. There's this tendency in the philosophical historical narrative that pits Aristotle against Plato. We look at even at the famous School of Athens by Raffaello, right? By Raphael, the famous painting where you have these ancient philosophers. find Plato with his hand like this, pointing towards the sky, and then you find Aristotle holding his hand down, like Plato being the transcendent, the idealist, etc., whereas Aristotle is telling him, oh, whoa, 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 what you are looking for is here in this world. This is where the forms exist. The forms can't exist on their own. You need the things which contain the forms. Individual things contain the forms. And anyways, the narrative is that that Aristotle and Plato sort of are opposites. This is really not the case. You know, they had much overlap between them. And Aristotle, Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, was influenced much by Aristotle, but likewise he was influenced also by Plato through Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is a school of thought that sort of renews Plato's ideas, is influenced by Plato's ideas, and then takes them further, tries to modernize them, tries to make them, tries to advance them. Aquinas was acquainted with Augustine's work, Augustine of Hippo, Saint Augustine, which we've covered already. And through Augustine's work, we can see Aquinas being influenced by Plato, by Neoplatonism, especially when we look at Aquinas' understanding of God, for instance, or his ideas about the soul, or his ideas about the nature of reality. There are Neoplatonic concepts like the idea of the One, capital O, or the hierarchy of being. We can call them Augustinian ideas as well. This idea of the hierarchy of being, we mentioned last time how there is a hierarchy of being because you start with God, which is the source, and the further away you go, the more distance you get from that source. Therefore, the more distant you get, the sort of more fallen you become, and that's a way to illustrate this hierarchy of being. He was also like I said at the end of it, a theologian. So whichever theological debates, whichever controversies were happening at the time, this was influential on him. Now, moving into the actual content of his thoughts, and like I said, Aquinas attempts to synthesize Aristotle's philosophy with the principles of Christianity. One of the ways he does this, one of the results of this actually, is that he tries to prove God's existence. And he does this in 5 ways. He finds what we call the 5 proofs of God's existence. And a brief overview of these arguments are that, first of all, God as immovable mover. He calls him the immovable mover, right? The first mover. It's called the argument from the first mover. So if you look around you and you see things moving, things move because someone else moves them. And if I place something on the desk and I go the next day and I don't find it there, it means because someone moved it. Someone must have placed it somewhere else. Someone must have taken it. If I'm sitting in a room and the window's open and there's a curtain and the curtain is moving, something is moving that curtain. What's moving it? It is being moved by the wind. And movement seems to imply that you have the thing being moved and the thing moving that thing being moved, which we would call the mover. Now, through cause and effect, the effect is the movement, the cause is the mover. But everything that moves seems to have a mover. So let's say I'm playing billiards and my billiard ball is a billiard ball has been hit by the white ball, right? By the white billiard ball. So we have the red one, the white one, red being moved by the white being moved by the stick being moved by my arm being moved by my brain. So there seems to be the sequence of mover, movement, mover, movement. And Aquinas tells us there are two possibilities. Either you go back infinitely, or you get to, which he claims is something, it's a bit ridiculous, he says, or you have to admit that at some point something must have started this movement. And he calls that the first mover. He goes for the second option, for there being a finite amount of how far back can you go of movement, mover, until you hit a wall where you can't really go beyond. And that would be the first mover, which would be God. That is his first argument. That is his first, what he calls the first proof of the existence of God. There his the second argument is called the argument from causation. The argument from causation is very similar to the argument from movement, from the argument of the first mover. So, when you have things which exist, someone must have made them. You look at a pencil, you look at a desk, at a pair of glasses, whatever. Someone made them. We call that a cause, right? In fact, again, using Aristotelian terms, Aristotle comes up with the famous 4 causes of being. One of them being the efficient cause. What is the efficient cause in Aristotle? Efficiency in this sense has nothing to do with how well you do something, right? In Aristotle's sense, the efficient cause is the creator. So, if I'm looking at a desk, if I'm looking at a chair, if I'm looking at a bed, say, the efficient cause would be the carpenter. The carpenter is the cause for these things to exist. So, in that sense, one then asks, but what made the carpenter? And you can go back by saying, it was the parents. But who made the parents? And again, you go the chicken and egg sort of circle, until you get to the point where you think, but who made the first chicken, or the first egg, or the first person? And it's a stumbling block we still somehow face today, although we have ways how to explain that. But Aquinas claims that the first cause, there has to be a first cause. You can't regress infinitely. You have to stop somewhere, and that stoppage is God. So that is his second proof for God's existence. There are more. There's the argument from degree, for instance, and this again mirrors a bit what Augustine said. The argument from degree echoes what Augustine said about goodness. So if you compare two things, you'll see that one is better than the other, maybe by a hair, but maybe by much. I don't know, take two apples, one of them seems to be nicer. In fact, you go for the nicer one. Why do you do that? Because there's a degree of how good one is over the other. So let's say you have more than two apples, you have 10 apples, and you're being asked, okay, so now put them in order, starting with the best apple you end with the worst one. And the best one is the biggest one, the juiciest, the nicest, the whatever. The worst one is the one with the worms climbing out. And you can do this because you have an idea of degree, of a scale of goodness. There's a scale of truth, a scale of nobility, say. So there must be something that is at the very end of the scale, at the very end of goodness. Essentially, if we take this scale, if we take this sequence of degrees, we end up in the place of perfection. We end up where perfection is. We can see perfection now. You can call it perfection. Aquinas chooses to call it God. That would be yet another proof for God's existence. There are more. There's the argument from contingency, what he calls the argument from contingency. There's also the argument that he calls as final cause. And the argument from contingency is interesting because it claims that we perish, we die, and then the people that are coming after us will also die eventually. People who came before us clearly are dead. Today I learned that apparently there have lived approximately 100 billion people since the arrival of humanity on Earth. No idea how they got to that number, but so it seems. It's the most often quoted number. Well, most of them are gone, same with any other organism that's ever lived. Almost any other object that's ever existed. It has changed, it has gone, it has disappeared. And the argument from contingency claims that somehow there must be a constant in existence. So things come and go, but there must be something that keeps going, that sort of makes it possible for things to come into existence. And that thing, since it makes existence possible, it itself is not perishable. So when we claim that a pencil exists, we're saying that there is a pencil, right? But we're also claiming that this thing, since there's a point where it didn't exist, and then eventually there will be a point where this thing will not exist anymore, that existence doesn't just happen. Something must be bringing it about. Now, this can be said of anything that exists. Like, existence is something that is given to things. You can't just make yourself exist. You can't just bring yourself into existence out of nothing. Something must be bringing things into existence. Now that something, since it's in a very privileged position to make existence possible, existence itself possible, that means that existence is something that it possesses implicitly. It can not only give it to it doesn't only have it, but it gives it to other things. And that thing has to be, not it has to be, but that thing has to exist. Aquinas chooses to call it God. I think it makes sense why he calls it God, because it makes existence possible. God as the creator of everything. In fact, we have this term called the Pantocrator from Greek, the God, the maker of everything. Panto means everything, Krator, we have the name creator, we have the term creator nowadays. The last thing, the last proof is that God is the final cause. We've already seen God as the efficient cause. Now we're looking at God as the final cause. And what does a final cause mean? The term final cause is once again Aristotelian. The final cause is the telos of things. It's where things want to go, where things should end up. Our telos, according to Aristotle, is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is the flourishing that we should experience as human beings. If we want to reach the zenith of who we are, we aim for eudaimonia. Now, that eudaimonia is interpreted by Aquinas as meaning this peak of existence. Now, for us, what is the peak of existence? It's the afterlife. It's the going to heaven. It's the joining God, basking in God's light, eternal light, basking in perfect goodness, reaching that point. So again, we see how Aquinas takes what is essentially a pagan philosopher, a pagan thought, and somehow spins it, applies it to Christian, to his beliefs, to Christian theology. But this also serves as a lesson, because we see how often what we think is something exclusive to some religion has genesis, has roots in other belief systems. We can trace more or less where beliefs come from, and this applies not just to Christianity, mind you, it applies to a lot of things, to a lot of belief systems, a lot of religions. All religions seem to somehow trace their sources to other, not just religions, but also philosophies. Anyways, so moving on a bit and talking yet again about God as the source of all that is good. So we've already said that God is God exists based on the argument from degree. This scale of goodness that we've mentioned, the scale of truth or nobility, etc. And goodness would be a transcendental quality. So, since everything is created by God, and we can trace existence to God himself, once again, it's the argument from contingency, then anything that exists, by default, necessarily so, has to have at least a little bit of good in it. This is an argument we've already faced with Augustine. Now, following Aristotle, Aquinas then claims that an act is good or bad depending on whether it contributes or it deters us from, to be honest, from the proper human end. That telos that we've mentioned, that final goal, right? The final cause, the end cause, at which all human action aims. Let's keep in mind that we are moral beings. We have moral agency, and this moral agency allows us to practice good from evil. We're able to discern good from evil, and we should pursue good actions if we want to become better persons. Now, this practice of performing good deeds will eventually lead us to our final goal. It's the telos, it's why we exist, really. It's the end goal, to reach eudaimonia. By achieving eudaimonia, essentially, we flourish into what we're meant to be. And achieving eudaimonia requires a range of skills, it requires a range of virtues, intellectual and moral virtues. These enable us, these help us to understand the nature of happiness. Eudaimonia is often translated as happiness. My preferred translation, my preferred based on what I read, right? Based on commentaries by experts. The preferred translation would be flourishing, to grow into something. Why do we distinguish between happiness and flourishing? Because happiness should not be the aim. We shouldn't aim to be happy. We should aim to flourish. Now, by flourishing, we will also end up being happy. But it's the side effect of what we aim for. We shouldn't aim for happiness. That's something the Epicureans claim. But Aristotle goes for flourishing as a human being, for being a better person, not necessarily happier, although that is what happens when you're a better person, but it's not the goal. It's the benefits that come with reaching eudaimonia. Now, Aquinas believes that we can only achieve complete or final happiness when we unite supernaturally with God. And this can't happen in this life. For Aristotle, eudaimonia was a lifelong practice. You keep practicing it. How? By studying, by observing what you consider being morally superior people, by using rationality, etc. It's a lifelong pursuit. For Aquinas, this goes even beyond the lifelong pursuit. Why? Because him, being Christian, understands that we reach our peak when we are in union with God. And this, of course, for Christians, happens after you die. You don't go to heaven before you die, you go to heaven after you die. And so, to do this, it's not just about you being virtuous. You can be virtuous, you can be a virtuous person, and in a sense you can be called a good person. But for Aquinas, you need to be virtuous, and you also need God. You need the presence, you need the influence, you need the acceptance, you need the recognition of God. You need to have the recognition of, you need to recognize that God is the goodness itself. So what you should be aiming for is union with God. So in a sense, he's claiming that unless you have God, you can't really reach eudaimonia, or at least that's Aquinas, not Aristotle. But having said that, so God is goodness itself. And let's discuss a bit this concept of goodness vis-a-vis God. When we talk of a good person, when we speak of a good person, it's like we mean that goodness is something that person has. So I have a friend who's a really good friend, and it's like goodness is a trait that that person has. But that seems to imply also that this could be different, you know? This could be, it could be the case that this really good friend, something happens and they stop being a really good friend. Perhaps, you know, I don't know, they become enemies or whatever, but we stop thinking of them as being good friends. Does that mean that the person is gone? No, it's still the same person, and we've seen arguments from philosophy claiming what makes a person, right? And the argument from memory, the argument from the body, as we've seen, Leibniz, etc. The person is still the same, but somehow the goodness trait has changed. That is possible if you are a human being. But when it comes to God, goodness, Aquinas claims, is not some property that God has. Goodness is not something that exists separately from God. It's not something that exists independently of God. It's not anything distinct from God. So, God is good means something more than God has the property of being good. God is good has a different meaning from saying Tom is good or chocolate is good. When we say God is good, we're meaning that God is absolutely good. God being the source of goodness in everything else means that goodness itself emanates from God. Why? Because God is goodness. In totality is goodness. So when we say the two terms, when we use the two terms, God on one hand and goodness on the other, we're meaning the same thing. They mean exactly the same thing. They are the same thing. You can't have God that is not good. And you can't have goodness without God. They are one and the same. So that is why we said that goodness is not some property that God has, but goodness is God. And of course, God is goodness itself. But when I say goodness is God, I mean goodness in itself. So when we see good things, it means that we're seeing God expressing Himself, essentially. Taking the argument we've already mentioned, the argument from degree, which is borrowed a bit from Augustine. So God is not just good, it's not only good, but God is the greatest good. And Aquinas would argue that God is the greatest good in the sense of being the source of all the perfections towards which we're being ordered. You know, this hierarchy of being, this order of being, we can call it. Now, when you have a hierarchy, when you have an order of things, what happens is that the lower rungs point towards the top. They're ordered towards the top, towards that point that is the most important, the top of the hierarchy, and therefore being God also implies that everything else that has existence, that has being, is ordered towards that perfection. Now, we have God as the source of everything that is good, God being goodness himself. And everything has existence because existence comes from God. God is the source of everything that is good, therefore what is evil? The question is. Well, evil would be privation. So evil is the lack of good that is due something. So when things exist, they already have some form of goodness in them by virtue of existing. Now, not everything that exists on the same plane. You have a hierarchy of, well, you have degrees of goodness, and that is how we can then claim that nothing can be totally evil, because if it exists, it already shares some sort of goodness. It already has its own share of goodness. Again, this echoes what we mentioned with Augustine. But if we had to say that evil exists, absolute evil exists, then we would be claiming, the claim would be then that that sort of absolute evil would be the total lack of good. It would be the lack of existence. It would be nothing. That essentially is where absolute evil exists. So essentially, absolute evil doesn't exist. It's a bit of a conundrum in a sense, because you're saying that everything that exists, since it exists by virtue of existence, has at least something good. Why? Because existence itself is good, because it comes from God. Everything that exists comes from God. But absolute evil, remember, nothing can be absolutely evil. Everything has at least a little bit of goodness in it because it exists. So absolute evil would be it's absolute. What does it mean? It means it has no good in it. So it's a total lack of good. But for something to be totally not good, it has to totally not exist. Therefore, it would be nothing. So nothing is absolutely evil. Just by virtue of existence, something is at least partially good. This is an important concept to grasp. So nothing can be totally evil or pure evil, because an evil thing must first be a thing. It has to exist. And consequently, if it has some existence, then also it has some good. God is the cause of that good. Now, since evil is the lack of existence, therefore God is not the direct cause of evil. So God is not the direct cause of evil, but this seems to say that God can be a cause of evil. We're just saying that he's not the direct cause of evil. Stretching this a bit, then we can say that he is the cause of evil only indirectly. But how? Because God causes things, makes things, creates things, allows things to exist in which there is found some evil. How? By virtue of those things being distant from God, distant from goodness. Now, let's talk a bit about his ideas on free will and moral evil. So, free will for Augustine, for Aquinas, has several characteristics. First of all, there is what he calls non-compulsion. What does this mean? It means that free will is not compulsive. It's not constrained. A compulsion is a constraint on free will. Right? When one is compelled, it seems that one is not able to choose autonomously, not able to choose freely. So when we say that free will is non-compulsive, we're meaning that free will is not constrained by external forces, not constrained by necessity. So we have this ability to choose our actions without being forced, without being coerced. The second point that he brings up is that free will is indetermined. We've spoken a bit about determinism. What is determinism? Determinism is the idea that things have causes, external causes. This seems to defy a bit the idea of a free will. Because if you believe that free will exists, it means that nothing external is causing you to choose this over that. We call it autonomy. To be autonomous means to be able to choose for yourself, not to be forced into decisions. If you're being forced, you can't say you're responsible for those decisions. But on the other hand, moral responsibility claims that you must have free will. But Aquinas argues that there is indetermination. So essentially, free will allows us to choose between alternative possibilities. These alternative possibilities, these choices that we make, can't be predetermined. They cannot be preordained. So this means that he's not a determinist, essentially. This brings questions, this sort of brings up questions then on how much God knows. Because if we claim that God knows everything, including the future, what is the future about? The future is about your choices. What is my future? Well, my future is based on that long series of choices I go through in my lifetime. And therefore, if we're claiming that nothing is predetermined, nothing is preordained, because that is how free will works, then it seems to beg whether God, when we claim that God knows everything, is omnisapient. This actually includes my choices tomorrow. One argument is that the definition of God as omnisapient implies that God can't know illogical things. So when we claim that that God knows everything and can do everything, we're not also claiming that God can make 1 and 1 equal 3, for example. Why? Because that is illogical. If that were the case, if God can make 1 and 1 equal 3, it would mean that God is irrational. And that would mean that God is not perfect. Because irrationality is not perfection. Rationality is perfection. This has a long history in philosophy, as we've seen even with Plato. Plato claims that you can really understand the ideas, his famous theory of forms, through the practice of rationality. Plato, Aristotle is the same. Aristotle is claiming that you need rationality to get to to get to real knowledge. What is real knowledge? Real knowledge is real truth. Truth with a capital T is the realm of God. It's the universal. What is God if not universal? And universal things can't be illogical, can't be irrational. They have to be rational, they have to be logical. Therefore, to claim that God can make 1 and 1 equal 3 is illogical. Therefore, if God were illogical, he would not be perfect, he would not be God at all. So that's one of the claims that come up when we claim that God can do everything. Well, everything except things that are illogical. It doesn't mean that he's less powerful. It means that that is the sort of omnipotence we're talking about. That is the sort of knowing everything we are talking about. Also, God's omnipotence and God's omnisapience, the ability to know everything, precludes him or her or it knowing our future. In God's greatness, our future is a mystery, because that means we have free will. God gives us free will, runs the argument, and that free will is truly free if it's not known, if it's not preordained, if it's not predetermined. If it's predetermined already, if it's written, so it was written, so it was written, so it shall be done. Something like that means that what you have the illusion of having choice, but it's already written, so there's no choice really. This is palm reading, this is reading tarot cards, this is reading the future. But that means you have no choice. Whatever you think you're choosing, that's an illusion. But true free will, true autonomy means that your choices are hidden. They're not actually, they're even more than hidden. They don't exist yet, because you will create them as you choose, as you go through life. So again, God being omnisapient, knowing everything, God being all-powerful, etc., and you having free will, and God not knowing from before what you will choose, doesn't make God less powerful. It just makes God God. That's it. That is what God is. That is what God also gives you as a gift, sort of this gift of free will, the ability to choose right from wrong, therefore giving you morality, moral choice. Moving on a bit, there's also this idea of self-determinism, right? Self-determinism means the ability to determine yourself. Now, I've already said that determinism, is not something that Aquinas would agree with, but that means determinism as an external force to you. When other things make you do things, say God's plan, or the future, or the stars, whatever, or the planets, those are external things making you do things. Those are things that take away from your free will, that determine you, predetermine you, preordain you. But self-determinism means that we have free will, and that free will is intrinsic to our being. It's intrinsic, we're born with it. We have it once we exist, once we have the to be thing about us, then we have self-determinism, we have free will, we can determine ourselves. And that is the very essence, that's the very foundation of our ability to make choices, to act autonomously. So it's not that Aquinas doesn't think that determinism exists in the case of our moral choices, but it's not an external thing, but it's something we have power over. We have the power to determine ourselves. Through how? Through moral choice, through moral agency, we call it. Now, where does free will originate from? According to Aquinas, this is located in God's creation of human beings as rational beings and spiritual beings. So we are creatures, we're things created. That means with intellect, we have will, and the intellect makes us capable to understand. The intellect makes us able to gain knowledge. Will makes us able to choose. Now, if we have good will, we're able to choose the good, and that is what we should be choosing, really. So, moral choice is made possible through these two things. When I say moral choice, it can be considered it's another way of saying free will. So essentially we have free will because we have an intellect and we have the will itself. This is thanks to God making us both rational and spiritual. Now, when it comes to the relationship to moral evil, Aquinas acknowledges that free will is the power to choose, right? And this power to choose allows us to deviate from the good. So, if you have the power to choose, but you can only choose what's good for you, well, not for you, you can only choose what is good, that's it. It's not like you have a choice, really. You can only choose what's good, that's it. So, free will implies that we have that power to choose between good and evil. When we choose good, well and good. When we choose evil, we are led to moral evil. What is morality if not the choice between good and evil? Therefore, moral choice is what leads to moral goodness or moral evil. And it's one may think that when we choose moral evil, we're somehow negating free will. right? We're somehow giving up on our free will, we're letting go. But that's a bit problematic, because when we think of moral choice as either you choose good or oh, I was really weak. No, wait. You weren't weak, according to this argument, right? But it's not that you were weak. It's not like you negated free will. It's not like you didn't exercise free will. No, you exercised free will, but you abused that power of free will. So free will is absolute power. Why? Because it's moral power. It's power over good and evil, power of choice between good and evil. So by choosing to do the wrong thing, the evil thing, the bad thing, you're not negating free will, you're just abusing it. You're just abusing that power that's been given you. Again, claiming that you're abusing free will, in a sense, is something that Sartre also claimed when he said that you're condemned to be free. You are free even when you choose not to choose. That is a choice, Sartre tells us, in the 1950s and 40s and 60s, right? You're condemned to be free. You're always choosing even if you think you're not choosing. Because free will is that. Free will is free, is to choose freely. You choose freely even when you decide not to choose freely. So essentially you're always choosing. It's your responsibility. It's your weight to carry. This, interestingly, mirrors what Aquinas was claiming 800 years before. 700-800 years before Sartre. Of course, interestingly, because Aquinas is a church father, he's one of the greatest, biggest, most important figures in the Christian world, whereas Sartre was an atheist philosopher. He denied the existence of God. But when it came to free will, they pretty much claimed the same thing when it came to moral choice. Now, what causes moral evil? Moral evil arises from a distorted use of free will. It's a deficient use of free will, when we don't quite use free will the way we should. When we choose to act against our reason, against our conscience, we're turning away from the good and embracing evil. One of the terms that comes up a lot when discussing Christianity, even other religions, but Christianity especially, is the concept of sin. The whole premise behind Christianity is sin. The whole falling from the garden, or from the whole fall in the garden of evil with Eve's apple, what we call an apple now, and it's more of a fruit, but so you have the picking of the apple, and then this fall, the first sin, and then you need actually for God to make himself human, send his only begotten son, and the son sacrifices himself on a plank of wood, essentially, with all the nails and the crown of thorns and all the humiliation and the whippings. Why? Because of sin. We spend a life trying to avoid sin. Avoiding, why? By choosing, right? By free will. We spend this life avoiding sin. Why? So then we're clean enough that when we die, we join God in this perfect, sinless, beautiful, absolutely good existence post-death. So sin has a role to play, a very, very extremely important role to play in Christianity, and also in Aquinas' philosophy, Aquinas' theology. And Aquinas identifies sin as the primary cause of moral evil. Sin is a voluntary act against reason. Sin is something that we choose to do voluntarily. Whenever we talk of free choice, there's volition behind it. There's wanting to do, wanting to sin. And in this case, it's wanting to go against God's law. Sin corrupts our free will, and it leads us to make choices that are harmful to not just to ourselves but also to others. So essentially, sin it stands for the fall. It stands for not just the fall of Eve and the fall of Adam and the first sin, but it's constantly there. It's what we're fighting against every single time we have to face a moral choice. A moral choice is between good and evil, always. That is it. That's what free will is about. Moral free will. It is the type of choice, the type of will that matters really. Free will. Free will between choosing good and choosing sin. Moral evil is sin. Sin is moral evil. So what remedies do we have when it comes to moral evil? Informed choice. So making informed choices helps us overcome moral evil. These informed choices should be based on reason and conscience. They can help us avoid actions that are morally wrong. The more information we have, the better our position to choose between sinning and not sinning. Not sinning being doing what's morally right. A second thing, moral formation. Again, we see Aquinas' influence here. We see Aristotle's influence here. So, moral formation means cultivating moral habits. It means cultivating those virtues that can strengthen our capacity for good and reduce the likelihood of engaging in evil actions. How is this Aristotelian? Because Aristotle claims that the way to become more virtuous is, yes, to use reason, but also through practicing virtue. By doing virtue, the more we do it, the better we get at it. Again, moral formation is about cultivating moral habits. You become better by getting in the habit of choosing the better choice. And there's the third remedy for moral evil. We've mentioned informed choice, we've mentioned moral formation, now there is grace. And the role of God is fundamental here. So God's grace is what ultimately helps us restore our free will. It helps enable us to make choices aligned with the good. God's grace is not something we have control over, but it's something that God grants us, that God gives us, that hands us God's grace. And as we've seen, this Aquinas' understanding of free will, of moral evil, of what sin is, this provides a sort of framework for understanding our capacity both to choose what's good and to choose sin, to choose more what's morally bad, what morally evil. But ultimately, we're given this gift, this fundamental gift, freedom. Again, this sort of echoes Sartre, because Sartre, once again, he says that it's not a gift for Sartre. For Sartre, it's a condemnation. We're condemned to be free, but we're fundamentally free. We're radically free. We have radical freedom. Aquinas does the same. He also claims in his own way, perhaps not in the same way Sartre does, but Aquinas claims that freedom is radical. We have radical freedom. That radical freedom demands responsibility. It demands a commitment. That commitment is to choose according to our moral compass. I've mentioned Sartre a few times. Let me not confuse you, but do keep them distinct, right? There are some things that seem to echo each other, but again, when it comes to Sartre, there is no such thing as God's grace. Sartre was an atheist. But many other things, informed choices, this applies as well. And my reason for bringing Sartre up and bringing this comparison is to show how morality, when it's believed that morality somehow can be universalized, the same can be said for Kant, for instance, there are overlapping things there. There is the primacy of free will. There's the primacy of you being a moral agent. There is the primacy of choosing between acting good and acting bad, acting in a good way, acting in an evil way. And that sort of, by recognizing the potential for moral evil, we can then strive to strengthen our free will. The more you do it, the better you get at it. So essentially, that is one way for us, that is the way for us to make choices that promote goodness, not just in ourselves, but also in the world around us. Once again, this idea of promoting goodness in yourself and the world around you finds distinct reflections or echoes in other philosophers. We hear something along these lines when we do Kant, the universalization principle. You choose to do good through rational thought, but also, how do you know that you're doing good? Because what you do should benefit everyone, should benefit world, should benefit mankind. We are a kingdom of ends, says one of the formulations of the categorical imperative, of Kant's categorical imperative. Likewise, something similar is said by Sartre, once again. When you choose, you're making a claim of what you think should be the right choice. You're making a claim to others. You're sort of displaying what you think should be the right choice. That's where moral strength is rooted. This ability to transcend the simple choices of one individual. That brings to a close Thomas Aquinas. Next time we will be looking at Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz, and with Leibniz it gets interesting because he has a few things which are quite different. He was a determinist as well, so that's this idea of a pre-established harmony, for instance, that we'll be looking at. We'll look at his optimism. He's called a moral optimist, right? We'll look at free will versus determinism. We will look at different forms of evils, the principle of sufficient reason, the doctrine of pre-established harmony, which I've already mentioned, and then we will look at Voltaire's criticism of Leibniz. Voltaire maybe hated is too strong a word, but if there's a synonym to hate, that would be Voltaire's attitude towards Leibniz's at least works, if not the person. This is for next time.